I can think of an example about 10 years ago when, I think it was during the Persian Gulf War, when a group of AIDS activists went both to CBS and PBS during the nightly newscasts, and they started to chant something like "Kill AIDS, not Arabs." And they got into the actual network studios when Dan Rather first came on the air, and the same with the NewsHour with McNeil Lehrer. And they started to speak out. And in Dan Rather's case, they went right to a commercial. And in the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour, they said, you know, these people are concerned about AIDS, and but they actually got into the studios. And of course, there's been major protests outside of networks for a long time, media activists who are protesting their coverage.
There are, if you're interested, large-scale media activist groups now being organized. So most of it's being done, to my knowledge, by Bob McChesney at the University of Illinois, who has quite a popular network going.
Okay. I'd like all three of you to answer the same question, but David Goodman, I already gave you outside a list of some of the countries the U.S. has troops in. Apparently there's 135. I'd ask you to write something about it. Amy Goodman, I'd ask you to have a radio show which tries to explain to us why there are U.S. troops in so many countries. Tonight I'd ask Noam Chomsky to answer briefly, do you think there are different reasons why the U.S. puts troops in different countries, maybe 135 countries, Barbados, Mongolia, as well as some of the ones we've heard of like Colombia and Haiti? Or do you think there's basically one reason why the U.S. puts troops in so many countries? And if so, what is that one reason or many reasons?
Well, I mean, there is an overriding reason, namely if you want to be a world dominant power, you're going to have military bases scattered as a way of exercising that power when needed. So yes, there's one overriding reason, and that goes right back to the beginning of the Second World War. When before the Second World War, the United States was not a major player on the world scene, was regionally a little bit in the Pacific and so on. It was obvious at the beginning of the Second World War that the U.S. was going to come out of the war as the world dominant power, and it intended to maintain that power by the use of force if necessary. In fact, Bush's national strategic strategy that caused so much anger, rightly, virtually echoes internal studies of the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations back in 1941 in almost the same terms. So yes, there is an overriding reason. But then, of course, you look at the particular places, there are separate reasons. So the troops around the Andean region are there because the Andean region's in turmoil and they're surrounded by U.S. military bases. It's a very strategically very important area for the U.S. It's a potential source of energy on which the U.S. expects to rely. There are a lot of popular forces there, and my own suspicion was, frankly, that if the Iraq War hadn't been so grotesquely mishandled by the Pentagon managers, an astonishing failure, they probably would have invaded the Andes by now. But that's what the bases are there for, and in other places they're there for other specific reasons.
I wanted to apologize to the long line of people there. Because we have had three wonderful speakers tonight and not one, I'm only going to be able to take three more questions. So, next questioner.
I'll try to make it quick. This is another Saddam question. I read in Share International magazine over a year ago that Saddam had died on April 20. Also, recently they published that the Saddam that was found is not the real Saddam, that it's a look-alike. I haven't seen major media delve into this any further, request genetic proof or anything else. Do you have any comments on it?
I'm very skeptical, frankly, but there's no evidence, but I'd be very surprised if that were true. I frankly, I don't think it matters very much either.
Go ahead.
Contrary to what was said here tonight, the New York Times did not say that Professor Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive, and for some reason the professor has allowed this myth to persist over the years. Rather, it was an outsider who had a review in the New York Times book review section, Professor Paul Robinson. For some strange reason, you have not corrected that myth. Now, as to the Goodman book, I find much that's comical and misinformation here, particularly your capital punishment.
Please, question,
Why
please.
do you perpetuate the lie in your book that the race of the victim determines who gets capital punishment? This is a well-known myth debunked by issue number 116 of the Public Interest magazine. And your biggest lie, perhaps, is your failure to acknowledge
Excuse me,
that the
you've asked the
reason
question.
blacks
Please
are
stop.
on death row is because they are committing murders in excess of their numbers. Why haven't you got the
Please
to admit that?
sit down. Thank you.
If you would like a comment on the Paul Robinson review, you're correct. The line that was quoted was from a review by Paul Robinson, and every time anybody mentions it and I have a chance, I say, why don't you quote the next sentence, which said, yeah, arguably the most important intellectual alive. How could he write such horrible things and terrible things about the United States? That was the next line, which also ought to be quoted. I don't know what your point was, but yes, that's been said over and over. Go ahead.
But I'm glad you brought up the death penalty. I think if you want to get information or facts on it, a great place to go is the National Coalition to abolish the death penalty that has lots of good information. And the single most significant factor in whether a person gets the death penalty, because it's interesting to point out that, of all the murders, less than 1% of the people get the death penalty. Why is that? Well, the single most important determinant is the race of the victim. If you're a black victim, it is least likely that the person who murders you will get the death penalty.
Next question.
We started out with Amy talking about we're being in a bleak situation. And there are two aspects of that I'd like to ask any of you to speak to if you feel like you'd like to. The first is, I think, as young Americans, mainly young Americans, very young Americans are dying every day in Iraq, and of course many more Iraqis. I think many Americans feel completely cut off from the young Americans who are over there. They volunteered. It's somebody else's problem. We're going around, the Red Sox are back in season, How do you understand this way in which we are, and of course media, I'm sure, play an important role in this, how we are cut off from the fact that today young Americans were killed in Iraq, Iraqis were killed, and if we're lucky, we'll get to wait till sometime in November to cast a vote in a swing state for John Kerry and hope that it'll make a difference. And the second part of this bleak situation is about that. I would ask Noam if you'd like to elaborate a little on what you see those small differences, and I'm not saying they don't exist, but what do you think are the small differences that can, given the scale, make a significant difference? And in this intervening time that we have where the killing will presumably continue, what else can we be doing other than wait until sometime in November to cast that vote?
Well, first of all, my own view, as you may or may not know, is that elections are a relatively insignificant aspect of what we ought to be doing. The propaganda system, including the media, tries to get you to focus laser-like on the fact that once every 4 years you have a chance to vote for two very similar candidates from the business party. That's not the important form of political activism. If we want to stop being a failed state and become a democratic society, things are going to have to happen in between the 4-year period. You want to, take Haiti. Take Haiti, the poorest country in the hemisphere. How was Aristide elected? Aristide was elected because in the slums and the hills of Haiti, where most of the population lives, there was actually a lively, vibrant civil society organized with a lot of grassroots movements and other kinds of activism. And nobody was paying any attention to it, because who pays attention to what those guys are doing? But to everyone's amazement, they succeeded in electing their own candidate. And the U.S. had a candidate in that election, a World Bank official, who everyone assumed would sail through. He had all the capital and everything else. He got 14% of the vote. They succeeded in developing a democratic society that could elect someone of their own. We can't even imagine that. We can take lessons from Haiti about what democracy is. And it's not showing up every 4 years and saying, vote for me. That's not what democracy is. It's all the things that happen to build up a democratic culture where you can run your own candidates. And you don't have to choose between, two men born to great wealth and political influence who went to the same elite university and joined the same secret society and are financed by pretty much the same corporate sources that allow them to run. Then you'd get a democratic society. What are the differences? I think you know as well as I do. There are differences. The people around Bush happen to be at a very extreme end of a rather narrow spectrum. They're very dangerous internationally. They're not only the invasion of Iraq, but many other things. They're pressing for development of military programs, which probably may very well do us all in. I mean, Clinton was pushing them too, but not at this level. They've compelled the Russians to respond. Russia has roughly tripled its military expenditures since they came in, and developing new offensive military weapons as a perfectly predictable reaction to the vast escalation that they're carrying out. They're developing new kinds of nuclear weapons, what are called low-yield nuclear weapons, bunker busters, which sounds kind of nice until you read the technical literature and discover that both the Russian and the American strategic analysts agree that the point of the bunker busters is to destroy Russian command bunkers with nuclear weapons hidden inside mountains just like ours are, so that they'll be vulnerable to a direct attack, and they're responding exactly as everyone knew, by extending their offensive military weaponry, threatening us. China's going to do the same, and so on. That's extreme. Bush, like Clinton, might pursue similar programs, but nothing at this level. Domestically, there's a very substantial difference. If you look at tax programs, the social benefits programs, and so on, the people around Bush are making a very dedicated effort to dismantle and destroy the entire array of progressive legislation and achievements that's been reached in the last century. Okay, now the Bush-Clinton people aren't all that much different, but they don't have this visceral hatred for democracy and social welfare that you find in the Bush programs. But they're not going to push through a tax program like Bush's. Well, those are small differences, but they do translate into big effects.
I am going to have to make this the last question from the audience. I'm sorry.
This is for anyone who'd like to comment. Is the 9/11 Commission a step forward to you in giving the public more objective information, or is it a step backward into heightened partisan debate, or is it neither to you?
Well, there's something very interesting about the 9/11 Commission and about the Clark revelations and the O'Neill revelations and so on. And the interesting question is why anybody cares. I mean, why is anybody surprised to discover that the priority of the Bush administration was to invade Iraq and that terror was a much lower concern? I mean, we know that. If we were able to believe, to express, to think, if we were able to think what the majority of people in Baghdad express, if we could reach that level of, independence and intellectual culture, we see that it's obvious. Yeah, their main priority was to gain the first secure military bases and dependent client state right in the heart of the major oil-producing region in the world. And the question of terror was quite secondary in that respect. In fact, we don't have to argue about it. What was the invasion of Iraq about? I mean, they understood perfectly well